Wizards of the Coast saved the most cherished format in Magic the Gathering, Legacy. Sure, Candelabra of Tawnos have been hanging out for like 27 years and not really caused a problem, but its days were numbered. You know, I mean, what else are they going to do? It's not like they could ban the One Ring, not when they have new copies of it with completely brand new art I've never seen before coming out in The Hobbit. But don't worry, gamers, Legacy is saved. We can rest assured that Wizards of the Coast has embraced their format that showcases cards from the entire history of Magic the Gathering and Wizards' unrelenting dedication to quality game design. Did you guys hear that? What is that?
Distraction makers.
The Fantasticar seems to be taking over Legacy. As some kind of sick joke, it seems that this card now slots into basically any shell of any deck that wants to play spells, so we've been blessed with such archetypes such as Vroomsday, Rhiannocar, Carbelcher, Mono Blue Fantasticar, a slightly different version of Mono Blue Fantasticar, now with more artifacts, Beseech Storm with Fantasticar, Mystic Forge with Fantasticar. But yeah, basically, if you plan on casting any kind of spell at all, if you put Fantasticar in your deck, you're probably going to end up with a 5-0. Unless you are paired up against another deck that's playing Fantasticar and happen to lose the die roll. Sorry. So, what is the Fantasticar? The Fantasticar is a legendary artifact vehicle. It has flying. It says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may have the Fantasticar become an artifact creature until end of turn. Whenever you cast your fourth non-creature spell this turn, you may sacrifice the Fantasticar. If you do, create 4/4/4 colorless construct artifact creature tokens with flying and haste. And it is a 4/4. And it costs 3 mana. It's not like Legacy players aren't trying to figure out a way to combat this card. Players have begun to include things like Force of Despair and Force of Vigor to try to directly combat this beast. And there's even been like this new version of like Mono Black Prison that plays 4 copies of Chalice of the Void, 4 copies of Trinisphere, and of course, 4 copies of the One Ring. Unfortunately, these extreme measures that are being taken don't seem to be having that big of an impact on the Fantasticar decks. As the most recent Legacy Challenge event, there were 20 copies across all of the decks that were in the top 8. So why is this card so busted? Like, what went wrong here? To me, it seems like the card at kind of every turn has removed some kind of stopgap for this type of an effect. Something like Chalice of the Void doesn't really work to stop this because you don't care if the spells are countered because it only counts if you've cast the spells, not if those spells actually resolved. Another sort of subtle advantage with Fantasticar is that it says whenever you cast a spell, you may turn it into a creature, which means that when you're trying to combo off to get the finale payoff of getting the 4/4/4s with flying and haste, you can choose for it not to become a creature. And so the different types of interaction that can affect the Fantasticar are limited to things that only affect artifacts instead of also things that would affect creatures. Things like Swords to Plowshares come to mind as kind of the gold standard for removal in the Legacy format. And so you're left with very few options to interact with this card up until the point when it becomes 4 different creatures, all 4/4s with flying and haste. Also, the fact that these 4/4s that come into play have haste is a little strange. We're going to come back to some of what's going on here because I think this is very commander-centric, sort of commander-focused game design. But there was something that designers saw with the mechanic Suspend, which was that when a player sort of satisfies a condition, it feels like they should be able to use that thing right away. In Suspend's case, it was that when the final time counter was removed from the Suspend creature, it came into play and players wanted to attack with it immediately. So Suspend was always a bit awkward because it said it gave creatures haste, especially when the Suspend cards were cards that were from colors that wouldn't normally have haste, things like blue. There's also another thing that's kind of interesting here because we can look at other cards that are similar to the Fantasticar in terms of there's some kind of requirement to be met and then you get a payoff. This concept is not all that new. In fact, let's take a look back at Urza's block where we got the card Hidden Gibbons. Hidden Gibbons costs 1 green. It is an enchantment and it says when one of your opponents successfully casts an instant or interrupt spell, if Hidden Gibbons is an enchantment, Hidden Gibbons becomes a 4/4 creature that counts as an ape. And I think this design, this sort of distinction between how these requirements are met is really important when we're talking about what's going on with modern Magic design. Hidden Gibbons requires your opponent to to have done something. And Fantasticar is all on your side of the field. And this just kind of adds to the pile of more evidence suggesting that Magic has moved more in the direction of parallel play and away from orthogonal play, where you're less concerned with what your opponents are doing. In a commander-centric world, it makes a certain amount of sense because you're playing your turn while everybody else at the table is sort of having a conversation and hanging out, and you're not going to necessarily want to be checking all the time for what your opponents are doing. It's one of the reasons why Ristic Study is super annoying. But when we look at 60-card formats, this type of design mentality has an extreme effect on the format because you can build and optimize in a way to be able to satisfy that condition very easily, especially in a format like Legacy. There's also fast mana and zero-cost artifacts that make it really pretty trivial for you to cast the 4 spells required to get the payoff for Fantasticar. So let's get into a little bit of what I am seeing as the big picture problem here. And it's that Magic's sort of design philosophy has moved away from quality, well-balanced sets to sort of novelty, right? And Fantasticar fits directly into that analysis. Not to say that all of the Marvel set does, but I do think that this example in particular is something that probably wouldn't have slipped through the cracks in, I don't know, say 10 years ago. Part of this comes from a particular kind of model, right? It's the idea that we were putting players on this kind of content treadmill where individual releases don't matter as much. The quality of them matters less, but quantity, right? The ability for us to put out sets rapidly to kind of move players' attention into the next new thing and to put an emphasis on casual play so players are not as concerned with the sort of balance and quality design parts of the game. Instead, they're focused on, oh, there's a new thing coming. And so we get this novelty with Fantasticar. Well, right now, it's like kind of funny, right? That these decks are showing up, the names are silly, and like there's an absurdity to the fact that this kind of ridiculous thing outside of the Magic the Gathering, universe is dominating Magic's most eternal format, right? The eternal formats, including Vintage, right? Where we're getting, of all things, the Fantasticar, right, is the thing that is breaking the formats. There's a novelty and a humor to it, but at a certain point that wears off, right? That's a fleeting feeling where we're left with the fact that this thing has broken the format in half. It is possible that Legacy can kind of correct for this issue, but it seems pretty unlikely when this card is so new and it's being put into basically any kind of strategy. And we've yet to see the optimized version of how to use the Fantasticar. Meanwhile, other decks will probably be playing catch-up with the things to combat this. This particular type of, content strategy comes from the live service game model. It is a way for companies to keep players engaged by constantly giving them new content. And in some ways, it's less risky, right? If you're investing in creating a thing that takes a very long time to make and is trying to be the highest quality it can be, that might not pay off, right? And instead, you can kind of split a game's release up into smaller chunks, and the quality of each of those individual things matters less because there's a new thing on the horizon. But the problem is that you are not only training your audience to be on this content treadmill, you also must maintain this content treadmill on the design side of things, where you have to develop a framework that is able to produce this kind of content in this rapid pace that will keep players interested. And you're competing against all of the other products that are doing the same thing. I guess from like a business philosophy side of this, it makes a certain amount of sense to just turn up the knob as long as you're making more money doing so. Why wouldn't you just continue to produce more and more stuff until you kind of find the breaking point where players aren't willing to deal with it anymore? World of Warcraft has kind of fallen into this category over the last, 10 plus years, where they're more focused on producing these sort of content checklists as a new expansion comes out that will kind of keep players engaged for a while, and then they'll come out with like a smaller patch that will sort of re-up that cycle. Players get a checklist again. They complete those tasks on the checklist, and then by that time, theoretically, you'll be ready to put out another piece of content. And the consequences there that we've seen is a lot of that content that happens in those stages doesn't stick, right? There's no reason to go back and revisit that old stuff because, oh, there's a new thing now, I'm going to go do that. WoW doesn't line up exactly with Magic, right? These things are different. Magic's content accumulates, especially in formats like Legacy. And I think for Commander players, it doesn't accumulate in the same way because you're constantly just sort of switching out stuff in your deck for new things that seem interesting, and you're not worried about optimization. But in formats like Legacy, it's almost like antithetical to the way this works, because you are incentivized as a player to play the best cards, right? So if you are constantly finding these cards that keep breaking the format and they accumulate over time, it's possible that Wizards of the Coast ends up in a position where it would be pretty difficult for them to take action to correct the format, because it's like death by 1,000 cuts. Like, how many cards would you have to ban in order to make the kind of impact that you would need to get the format back in a healthy state? And because it doesn't seem like they're willing to manage the format actively, they're taking a very reactive approach. Formats like Pauper that have like a format panel seem to be handling these types of things better. They're being much more proactive, which, whatever, it's kind of a reason why Legacy might need a format panel. There's sort of some, I've heard kind of in the Legacy community that it's a contentious topic, but at least you would have this curation happening to advocate for people who are playing the format. Where right now we're sort of left with reactionary bans that Wizards sort of waiting long, sort of a wait and see approach, right? The bigger question here is, yes, these design patterns, right? These product design patterns seem to be mirroring a microtransaction-like business model where you are continuing a content release schedule that sort of eliminates any mistakes that were made because you're just putting out new content to sort of divert attention from those things. And those mistakes are accumulating in formats like Legacy, but not necessarily in more casual ones. But like, is there any kind of evidence to suggest that is actually what's happening? Let's, for just a minute, take a look at the board of directors for Hasbro and see where their experience has come from. We've got Chris Cox, who is the CEO of Hasbro, and before that, he was, I think, the CEO of Wizards of the Coast. He's worked for Microsoft and Xbox, and he has been responsible for the major push for MTG moving towards Arena. We also have Elizabeth Harmon, and she ran Xbox Game Pass before becoming the CEO of Ring and All Trails. We have Owen Mahoney, who is the CEO of Nexon, who pioneered the free-to-play microtransactions for the game MapleStory. We have Hope Cochran, who is the former CEO of King, and she led the initial IPO and the acquisition by Activision of the company King. And then finally, we have Frank Gibeau, who was at EA for 20 years and publicly championed the shift from DLC to subscription and free-to-play microtransactions, then became the CEO of Zynga. There's just a few people, I guess. And it's not to say that like the board of directors are the people who are deciding day-to-day operations down the line to other people who are in charge of, say, Wizards of the Coast or Magic specifically. But we can see that this influence of microtransactions is heavily present in the leadership at Hasbro. So it shouldn't be much of a surprise that these design patterns are being implemented into Magic the Gathering. The Fantasticar will probably end up being banned at the next ban announcement. The next one's coming up August 10th. There's another sort of wrinkle here, which is that it is a Universes Beyond card, and Wizards of the Coast has been reluctant, it seems, in the past to take action on Universes Beyond cards. We saw this with the One Ring, which took them 6 months to ban in the modern format, and it is still not banned in Legacy. This happened with VV in Standard, which took them about 5 months to ban. And we can kind of contrast this to Nadu, which was printed in Modern Horizons 3 and was banned in Modern in 2 months. It did take them over a year to ban it in the Legacy format. They did finally take action on Nadu there. So part of this might be indicative of the hurdle to get over for action is bigger in the Legacy format than it would be in other formats. It is possible that the Fantasticar will continue to wreak havoc on the Legacy format, and Wizards might remain reluctant to take action. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Fantasticar and this situation. I feel like this is probably just indicative of the shifting focus of Wizards of the Coast onto this sort of release cadence that I'm talking about, right? Where we're less concerned with the quality of individual releases because a new one is around the corner. That will be the focus for the few months that we wait until the next release. If you'd like to join a community of like-minded game designers, you can join our Discord. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.